So I'm happy to report that we have found the science fiction. If you followed my last science fiction fantasy wrap-up, you'll know that it was pretty sparse on the sci-fi and pretty heavy on the fantasy. So I'm happy to say that the tables have turned. This video is going to include quite a bit of science fiction, including several new releases. I'll have a little bit of fantasy tucked away at the end, but if you're here for the science fiction, we are back, baby, and I can't wait to tell you about everything I read, good or bad. Let's get started. First, let's talk about The Blighted Stars by Megan O'Keeffe. This is actually a book I've already reviewed on my channel when it first came out, but instead I really want to talk about its sequels. So we have The Fractured Dark by Megan O'Keeffe, and then the third and final book, The Bound Worlds. And so I'm going to talk about these two additional books without actually spoiling anything. So the basic setup of the first book is that we follow a revolutionist and an heir to a dynasty that together end up on this planet and are essentially stuck there, and so they have to rely on each other. It very much plays into the tropes of individuals that are naturally enemies that have to work together reluctantly, which is something I really enjoy. Now, this is a series that I think leans into a lot of the traditional tropes of what we see in modern space opera and science fiction adventure stories, where you have the aesthetics of science fiction, but very much in a way that is accessible. So if you're someone who is newer to science fiction and more intimidated by the older classics or the books that lean onto the side of hard science fiction, I think these are very easy and digestible. Personally, I wish there was a little bit more depth to them. I think books like this really rely on having particularly interesting and compelling characters, and while I like both our protagonists, I didn't find them to be as compelling if you're comparing it to something like The Expanse, which maybe is an unfair comparison these days. But I'd say that if you love these kind of stories and are looking for more, this is a very digestible one to get into. I don't think it's the best the genre has to offer, but it was, again, easy to fly through, a solid new release in terms of this, and I thought the conclusion, all that, wrapped up the story quite well for what it was doing. Next, we have Full Speed to Crash Landing by Bev Revis, and this is a really short sci-fi novella that follows a woman who is working as a salvager when something happens to her ship and she gets herself in trouble. A group of individuals, a government-funded salvager crew, end up picking her up, saving her life. However, there is more to it than it seems. Is all in the premise where we know that she is keeping secrets, and so there is more that's slowly unraveled within the story. This one is incredibly short, it's easy to fly through, and it's a kind of science fiction I always describe where it technically has that science fiction or space background to the story, but it really lacks the world building that I would have liked. I think partially due to the length of the story, but I've also read novellas that accomplish a lot more in a short number of pages. Instead, this is one that is very much more character heavy, dialogue heavy, and really about the relationships between the characters. I would best describe it to something along the lines of the Wayfarer series, so there's a coziness to it. Now, in terms of our premise, this run really suggests that there is a big deep-seated mystery to it, and honestly, I expected the story to be much darker than it is, and that's why I clarified that I find this one to be quite cozy and really has a sweetness to it, which I didn't expect. So if you're looking for a really easy space adventure story to fall into, this is one that you might enjoy. It was enjoyable at the time, but honestly not the most memorable read. Next, we have Rumor Has It by Cat Rambo, which is the third book in a series that starts with You Sexy Thing. In the first book, we follow a group of former soldiers that have left that life behind and are now opening up a space restaurant and running it. And in this book, we have the same characters, or at least the same group of characters, as they are progressing through the plot. And that's what I like about this one, is that often when it comes to these kind of more cozy science fiction stories, is I find that the plot can really stand still, or rather there can be no plot and you just have the characters continually talking and discussing without a lot of narrative movement. Instead, each book really does progress the story and feels like a purposeful choice and an addition to the plot and story along the way. And I like that. I also think the characters in the time that the author has are reasonably fleshed out. They're likable, they're fun. As you can guess, again, anytime you have food in a story, it's going to be a little bit lighter, a little bit more enjoyable than heavy-handed or dark. But I think that this author does a great job of balancing that with enough of a deep plot to make me care and not make it such a candy read that it becomes forgettable. So I've become a big fan of this series. I've read the other two books, and this one in my mind is just at the same quality. Again, it's fun to return back to these characters and see where the story goes from here. Highly recommend this one. I do recommend starting back at the beginning though with You Sexy Thing, just because, well, first, the title is amazing, but also the fact that, again, this is a very character-driven story. While it has a bit of element when it comes to the world building, really it's about following the characters through these these events and the development that they have, and so I think you're going to get a lot more out of this one if you go back to the beginning. Next we have Eris by Larry Gaudet, and this is a story that follows a few different characters. You have this man who has invented this online game where we have individuals who will pay money to play this game where they are able to use these virtual tools to save the world. So they go through various projects and help save animals and people and save the environment along the way. It's a story about a game where people are rewarded virtually for doing good things, and we see this popularity growing around this game and really the keyboard activism that comes along with that. And then we also follow from the perspective of the developer's son, who happens to be an avid fan of this game. And then within the story, this is all in the premise or setup on the back of the book, but essentially you find out that there are those within the game that are potentially using it for nefarious purposes. There are terrorists who are trying to break things down from the inside, and the young protagonist gets pulled into that mess. Now, this is one that I love the premise of. I think in terms of the idea of a game where people, rather than going out and stepping out their door to actually save the environment or make the financial and social choices in their day-to-day life that are going to help save our world, they are much more drawn into going through the motions of doing that in a virtual world. So you get the adrenaline rush, the dopamine hit of doing the right thing, but in a way that actually has no consequences, or rather no positive results in this case. It's all, again, virtual. There is no tying back to the real world and actually making a difference. I think it's an interesting premise because for me, I see the believability of it. I think that we're often drawn to go through the motions of actions that will make us feel good without necessarily having, again, the actual repercussions that come with making the tough choices and doing the right thing. And so I think it's great. It's, again, a great conversation around keyboard warriors and those that are very active online in places of trying to do the right thing, but don't necessarily translate that to their day-to-day lives. So great conversation there. Honestly, I thought it was really interesting, and I wish it had been explored even more. However, the downside of the book is the fact that the narrative itself is what I would describe as messy. So again, you have multiple perspectives, which is fine, but the book doesn't feel entirely reined in. So at times it felt a bit more like a stream of consciousness or an early draft of a book, and I really think it would have benefited from a stronger editor who really would have taken the pieces, because even getting dropped into the story, I found that you didn't necessarily have as much information about the world of the video game as you would need to. And keep in mind, I'm someone who loves the figure it out as you go along type premise, but I really had to stop the book and stop reading it and go and read the premise of the book, because I didn't quite know what was going on until the author summarized it for me, or the publisher rather, in the back of the book in that synopsis, because the book itself was putting me in almost too blind in a way that wasn't satisfactory. It wasn't enjoyable to stumble through the book. Instead, it felt like the author forgot a prologue or a paragraph or two that would have explained a lot more and set more of the context for this book. So it's a 5-star premise. I loved what this book was doing. There was amazing sections. There was really interesting ideas played out in the narrative that I thought were so interesting, and I wanted to underline them and left me thinking about this book. However, I have to rate this book fairly because in terms of a narrative, it was all over the place, and it definitely did a disservice to the idea of the story, which again, I think far surpasses the execution of it, which wasn't great. I'm so conflicted about this book. I kind of recommend it if you just love a good book with ideas and can look past the actual structuring of the book and just go in to sample the ideas and aren't going to judge it too harshly. It's interesting, but I can only cautiously recommend it. Next, we have Saturation Point by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is a novella he published this year, and I gotta say, the guy has been busy with publishing in the last couple of years. And so this one follows a scientist who previously went to this area called the Zone, which is incredibly deadly to warm-blooded animals and people. And so because of that, you have to wear certain protection. And even with all of that, when they went in, terrible things happened, people died, and it was a horrible experience. Now this scientist is being sent back to the same area, reluctantly going there once again, and we follow her through that journey. This is one that I really enjoyed on several levels. First, I thought that it did a great job of setting up the character being set in a very modern day, talking about the very, again, topical issues of working from home and a lot of the modern life experience that we have right now. But then at the same time, it really captures that classic science experiment of going to this otherworldly type place. Clearly, it's meant to be a nod to works like Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, and I found this one to be really enjoyable. It had a slower start. I wasn't quite sure where it was going, but it had a good build. It was suspenseful, and if anything, I actually enjoyed it more than Annihilation, which is probably a very unpopular opinion, but I like this one a lot. Given the premise, I expected this to be a pretty standard story, and instead was pleasantly surprised that it had some good twists and turns and an ending that I didn't see coming, but was really enjoyable. It was one that I read and then reread again because I thought that there was a lot to unpack, and I really liked the places the author was going. So a short book, but probably one of the stronger recommendations in this video. There's a reason Adrian Tchaikovsky is so beloved, and I really think he shines in the novella form, so highly recommend this one if you haven't checked it out. If you missed it, because it almost fell off my own radar if it wasn't for all of you giving good recommendations, so thank you again for that, and for all the recommendations I got in my last wrap up, because by the way, if I haven't read them yet, don't worry, a lot of those books ended up on my Goodreads TBR, and you'll be seeing me read a lot more of your recs in terms of new list and backlist titles very soon next year. Next we have The Dying Earth by Jack Vance, which is technically a novel, but is made up of what it would be equivalent to a series of interconnected short stories. So this is one that is set in a future society that has regressed, and so it's technically a piece of sci-fantasy because while it is set in a future, it has regressed to the point of a society that feels quite old, and in fact brings in a magical component where there are wizards and other magical elements happening within the work. This is one that naturally reminded me of Book of the New Sun by Jean Wolfe, which personally I do prefer. I think that one is a little bit stronger just because it gets a bit more into the depth, and for me pulls back more of the curtain in terms of the science fiction, which I found most satisfying. Instead, again, this one leans in my mind more to the fantastical side, but I still very much enjoyed the narrative, which was beautifully written. You have this imagined world. I'll find that I'm just a sucker for a regressed society. I think it's just a really interesting concept to play with, and the idea that magic and technology can blur together in really interesting ways where perhaps is it magical or do we just not understand the technology behind it? And I think this is the kind of story that I liked. It's one that I read and liked it so much I immediately went back and reread it again as soon as I was finished, because it's the kind of story that you like it more the more you understand it, and it takes a while to dive in and really understand again more than the surface level, again similar to the Book of the New Sun. So highly recommend this one. I know it's a favorite for a reason. It's a beloved classic. You've probably read it already, but if you haven't, I do think it's worth checking out. I also read Station 11 by Emily St. Mandel, and this is a story of post-apocalyptic fiction where we follow a future of Canada and North America where there has been this outbreak of a flu. And so within the story, we follow a group of individuals who are Shakespearean actors, and in this imagined future, they go and bring this cultural element to this devastated world. Now, this is one that, despite the darker aspects of the story, does have a surprisingly nice, warm quality to it, and I think it's the fact that the author chose to focus on the goodness of humanity and give a spark of hope. Usually when we have these post-apocalyptic stories, the whole society goes fully Mad Max, and instead you actually have a remnant of culture, a remnant of remembering who we are and passing along that legacy along the way. And so there's a beauty to the story. It was easy to follow. Of course, always interesting to read in a post-pandemic world and reflecting back on the events of 2020 and how this compares to this flu in this imagined world. For me, I wish that this story had dived more into the science fiction elements. I would most recommend this story to those of you that are, again, less so hardcore science fiction readers and rather those that occasionally read science fiction and are looking for things kind of adjacent to it. Because while it's technically, again, having that pandemic element, it's much more focused on the characters, their relationships, and the world and how it's changed. And I would have loved to dive deeper into the understanding of, again, some of the larger world building. And so they would have tidbits where they talk about the fact that planes don't fly anymore, and you instead have these remnants of planes on the pavement. And I would love that to be a larger part of the story, but it just isn't. So again, if you're looking for a very character-driven, intimate perspective on a pandemic, but again, one that has some heart and emotions to it, this is one I'd recommend. Just know what you're getting yourself into. Next, we have Traitor Blade by Sebastien de Castell, and this is a story that follows a group of individuals who used to be the King's Guard. They were the great coats that were fighting for the king. However, they have been disgraced and disbanded. However, they are brought together to do a job and to work together once again. This is a story that was gifted to me, or at least the first audiobook was gifted to me by a subscriber, and I'm so glad glad because it's a book I had vaguely heard about, roughly compared to The Three Musketeers, which I have not at this point read. Let me know if I should check out that classic. And instead I went into this one fairly blind. First, I love the fact that this book focuses heavily on that brotherly friendship. So you have the back and forth between the brothers who have very much had their relationship or friendship strained and are once again coming together. And I love the banter that is built out of that. Very enjoyable. What I didn't think I would love so much, or was surprised to find so enjoyable, was the back and forth, the fighting within this, because again, this is all based off of footwork and intimate battling between these characters. And so you actually have more of their positioning and how they move in and out of each other's space. Very much, if you love things like fencing and swordplay, this is the kind of fighting that I found really fascinating. And I'm often someone who is not one to read a story for the fighting. It's often a part of it, and I will reluctantly read through the action portions because they're important to a story. But for me to find them some of the most entertaining parts of the story, to just want to read it and reread those sections, I could visualize them in my mind. It was just so enjoyable, and again, so unexpected. I had a great time with this one, and I definitely want to continue on with this series. Highly recommend if you want something that is relatively light, again, a little bit more of a fun, rompy story, but also has some good darker moments to it. It's not cozy, it's not overly fluffy, but instead is a good balance between some humor and also some serious stakes. I think this one is the perfect balance, and I had a really good time with it. So that is it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? Thank you again for all of you who left comments in my previous video talking about science fiction books and recommending me your favorites. I have so many more sci-fi books, both new releases and old releases, to put onto my list. You're definitely going to see me reading them in the coming months. So thank you again for getting more science fiction on my TBR. Those books definitely exist. I just need to find them, and sometimes I need a little bit of help with that. All that being said, if you're new to my channel, I hope you stick around and subscribe. I do read a lot of science fiction as well as other genres, so fantasy, horror, thrillers, and other dark things. You can help me out with this video by giving me a thumbs up, dropping a comment, even if it's just a little emoji, hitting that little notification bell. Otherwise, I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.